Hi, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about perhaps an esoteric subject, but something that's important to game designers and important for them to keep in mind, and that is, where is the interest in the gameplay coming from in a game? I'm not talking about the graphics or anything like that. I'm talking about gameplay. This roughly equates to whether the players are playing against other players, what the video games call PvP, or against the game environment, what the video games call PvE. In another way, you can look at it as related to the three types of game players: people who think all games are math, people who think games are about people, and people who think games are about story, which I tend to put as a subcategory of games are about people. So I'm going to go through a few categories of games and discuss briefly where the interest is coming from. In war games, it's obvious. The interest comes from the other players first and the situation second. And of course, the original war games are actually abstract, like chess and checkers and Go. Nowadays, they're often historical, or they may be fantasy or science fiction, but still, the first interest is the players. And if you're not keeping track of what the players are doing, you're probably not going to be very successful in a war game. Traditional role-playing games, the interest comes from the other players and from the GM. But the GM's more or less a neutral judge or referee, so he doesn't participate strongly the way that more recent RPGs are run, where the GM is telling people a story or arranging a story for the people. And then you can say the interest comes from the story rather than from the players. And certainly the story comes from the GM, although the players can participate as well. What about Euro games? Well, the interest comes from the designer who's put it into the game, which is often a form of puzzle. So the environment of the game as constructed by the designer is where the interest is. And that's going to be true of co-op games and solo games and so on. How about a single-player RPG, in other words, a video game? Or a massively online game? Again, the designer is creating the content. And part of the problem that massively online games have had is they take a long time and spend a lot of money making content, and players join the game and just play it like crazy for a month, and they've used up all the content. That's in contrast to a game where the interest comes from the other players. That is much more practical for the game designer to do, because the interest can come from the players ad infinitum. I know people who have played Britannia more than 500 times. Well, they're not playing for the environment. They're playing because of the other players. Certainly they like the environment, but it's the other players that really matter and really count. How about screwage games where you mess with your friends? Well, obviously the interest comes from the players there. How about party games? That seems to be a case where the interest mostly comes from the players. How about pick up and deliver games? Well, there it seems to come from the designer, because there's not a lot of interaction amongst the players. Again, you can look at this as whether there's a lot of interaction amongst the players or not much interaction. So when you design a game, one of the things you should decide consciously, but maybe it just happens, is where is the interest in the gameplay going to come from in your game? Thanks for listening.